Indian Uprising of 1857. Overview. The Indian Uprising of 1857 was the 25th and largest uprising against the East India Company in the century following the Battle of Plassey. It began in the May of 1857 when sepoys, Indian troops, stationed in Meerut rose up against their British officers for two reasons: the execution of the sepoy Mangal Pandey, who had tried to instigate a mutiny against the British earlier that year, and the imprisonment of the Muslim and Hindu sepoys who refused to use the newly introduced Enfield rifles because their cartridges were reportedly greased with pig or cow fat. A range of more deep-seated issues have also been cited for engendering the conditions for rebellion, including discontent over the doctrine of lapse, the loss of land and wealth to the East India Company in Britain, and Anglicizing policies. Unrest spread quickly to other regions of northern and central India, with a total of 26 sepoy garrisons rebelling, most notably at Delhi, Kanpur, Jhansi, and Lucknow, and civilian populations joined them. Rebel forces rallied around several leaders, including the Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah II, Lakshmi Bai, the Maratha Queen of Jhansi, and Nana Sahib, a Maratha prince. The British, though they brought in some European troops, fought mostly with sepoys, first under the leadership of Sir Colin Campbell, and later under the direction of Sir Hugh Rose. East India Company forces had gained the upper hand by the summer of 1858, and a peace treaty was signed in July. The rebellion caused British Parliament to pass the Government of India Act in the August of 1858, thereby establishing direct rule of India by the British Crown. Debate over the root causes of the rebellion, its meaning at the time, and its long-term significance has inspired a rich historiography that continues to expand.
The much debated reasons behind the events of 1857 in British India have to be studied through a historiographical lens. The significance of 1857 in British imperialist history and in Indian history provides a rich context for understanding the conflicting myths surrounding the events. The following presentation will delve into four of the major historiographical perspectives of 1857 in British India.
Contemporary British approach. In 1783, the East Indian Bill addresses the brutalities and conflict of interest regarding the mandate of the East Indian Company. Edmund Burke brings to light notions and established laws which fuel what he considers to be injustices within the Indian subcontinent. He ends up focalizing on laws such as the feudal tax and the transmission of feudal lands regarding orphan descendants. He then concludes that the company profoundly has an interest for its own riches rather than the well-being of the nation it's occupying. In 1813, 44 years before the Sepoy Rebellion, the Regulatory Act is introduced. Rhetorically, it's poorly welcome. The act allows Christian missionaries into a subcontinent that is already predominantly divided between Hinduism and Muslim traditions. Douglas and Piers mentioned that some Indian aristocrats did see the educative advantages that the missionaries brought to the table. Therefore, they did allow their children to learn some subjects offered by the missionaries, all while rejecting their religious beliefs and sentiments. Dalrymple does mention that by the end of the 18th century, the English government goes through drastic changes. A new conservative political collective is in power, which impacts the relationship with the subcontinent. Under the rule of Governor General Lord Wellesley, 1798 to 1805, the forward policy is put into motion. It opposes European rivalry, imposes and amends certain laws such as the Sati, and it encourages the removal of Muslim regimes due to its evangelical intentions. 1 year before the rebellion, the East Indian Company was on the verge of annexing the city of Avda because it was under a Muslim regime. A dossier romanticizing the whole operation was brought to the British Parliament. It stated that the region's population welcomed the annexation when in fact it did not. Based on William Dalrymple's research, an official who had taken part in the operation had denounced the dossier to be a work of fiction of official penmanship. On May 11th, Shah Zafar, the Mughal emperor, receives a letter sent to him by the rebels. The following is written: The English people who overthrow all religion, as the English are common enemy of both, we should unite in their slaughter. By this alone will the lives and fates of both be saved. Having received the blessings of the 82-year-old emperor, the mutiny sparks into wildfire. The rebelling sepoys then enter Delhi, radically killing all Christian men, women, and children.
Contemporary newspapers in England were predominantly condemnatory of the rebellion in 1857. All the same, there was support for the Indian movement in the Marxist perspective. Writing in the New York Daily Tribune, Karl Marx was one of the first to look at the economic aspects of the revolt. Further supported by Engels, M.N. Roy, and Palmdut, Marx's views contend that the events of 1857 were characteristic of a feudal outburst at the threshold of change in India. Before the mutiny, the British government, the British army, and the British administrators were all dependent upon Indians. The affluent and the poor all were perpetually oppressed by a British system to which they were loyal. Without the Indian subservience, it would have been difficult for the British to prevent the revitalization of the Mughal Empire. Though the mutiny started in a clear region within a specific group, as Marx writes, Muslims and Hindus have combined against their common masters. The mutiny has not been confined to a few localities. The revolt has coincided with a general disaffection across India. Even in regions that appeared to be unaffected, Marx noted symptoms of unrest were subtly visible and that it was nonsensical to believe Hindus were apathetic or even sympathetic with British rule. With the betrayal of the landholders and their alignment with the British, Engels and Marx presented the common people's role. The resistance, begun by mutinous soldiery, has found support from the inhabitants of the city and of the province at large. In the 1920s, with the creation of the working class movement, M. N. Roy concluded that the Revolution of 1857 was a struggle between the worn-out feudal system and the newly introduced commercial capitalism. 20 years later, Pomdut supported this position, adding that 1857 saw a major peasant revolt that, despite being led by decaying feudal forces, was fighting to regain their privileges and end foreign domination. The Marxist perspective is powerful and represents the only contemporaneous view from the Indian side. Importantly, it is in sharp opposition to the established orthodox theory of the uprising as a military mutiny, disfigured by native atrocities put down by British valor.
Now we'll look into the nationalist perspective. The nationalist perspective developed mainly around the time of Indian independence. As a result, their view of 1857 is greatly influenced by the Indian nationalist movement that was at a fever pitch during their time, hence their name. Despite being influenced by the same nationalist movement, historians among this school of thought are quite divided on many elements of 1857. You'll see this later on. Scholars that fall in this category are Nehru and Chaudhry. What makes the nationalist perspective unique in the 1857 discourse is that they are the first to describe this event more than just a simple mutiny or rebellion. In fact, they would coin the term the First War of Indian Independence. For instance, in his finest work, Discovery of India, Nehru describes 1857 as it was more than a military mutiny, and it spread rapidly and assumed the character of a popular rebellion and a war of Indian independence. However, there are within the nationalist perspective some scholars who refuse to call this pivotal moment in Indian history as an independence movement. For example, M.C. Majumdar, in his book The Sepoy Mutiny and the Revolt of 1857, believes that a lack of organization, unity, and plan amongst the leadership of the rebellion refutes the idea that 1857 was the first war of independence. He believed Indians rose up and attempted to oust the British people not because of a sense of nationalism, but because of the religious, economic, and social discontent experienced by the local population under British rule. According to modern-day historian Bishwamoy Patti, prior to the nationalist perspective, the historiography of the rebellion was mainly dominated either by how the victorious British triumphed or how the valiant Indians failed. Thanks to the nationalist perspective, scholars started to explore the context and the background of the rebellion in greater detail. One concept that becomes very dominant is that the rebellion was really a grassroots movement. Nehru briefly discusses about this in The Discovery of India when he mentioned that the mutiny assumed the character of a popular rebellion. Yet even so, we see some disagreement amongst the scholars on the influence of the peasantry, on what the influence the peasantry had on the rebellion. In his book, Civil Rebellion and the Indian Mutiny, Chaudhry states the Civil Rebellion is furnished primarily by anti-British, anti-colonial sentiment running through feudal channels. Compared to their predecessors, the contemporaries, the nationalist perspective starts to use a wider variety of sources. Sources deriving from the local languages in India start to make its presence in the discourse. Moreover, the oral traditions and folk legends of the peasant population is used as well. These sources start to make their use because the nationalist perspective attempted to look at the rebellion less from the British view and more from the Indians. Nevertheless, British sources remain somewhat dominant in use by these scholars, but are taken with a grain of salt.
Subaltern studies. The advent of subaltern studies in the 1980s greatly influenced the way historians studied the events of 1857. Adherents of this school of history strove to deconstruct the elitist aspects of the preceding historiography and to shed light on the contributions and motivations of populations outside the socio-political hegemony, thereby granting these populations an agency denied to them in older histories. Ranajit Guha, the primary figure in the establishment of subaltern studies as a discipline, explored peasant participation in the rebellion, arguing that they largely stayed within their respective rural regions during the uprising and were motivated by local concerns. In the 1990s, Tapati Roy also turned to examining peasant participation, but she pointed to the peasants who traveled to urban areas and accepted the leadership of rebels from outside their region to advocate for a nationalist conception of 1857 as a relatively united Indian uprising. Kumar Sharash Singh looks specifically at Adivasis, that is, the various tribes indigenous to the Indian subcontinent. He has drawn on Adivasi texts to illustrate the partnership that existed between tribal and non-tribal populations during the rebellion, to show how Adivasis drew on their previous experiences of resistance to colonial rule to make a unique contribution to the rebellion. Badri Narayan has devoted study to the important roles played by rebelling Dalits, those people who belong to the untouchable caste of the Hindu Varna system. Through a close study of their folklore, he has found that they not only performed an essential function by assisting upper caste leaders and landlords, but also organized independently to fight the British in their own right. One group that remains largely overlooked in the historiography is women. Biographies have been written on some exceptional female rebel leaders, in particular Lakshmi Bai, the Maratha queen of the princely state of Jhansi, who led the uprising in the Bundelkhand region. There has also been a rise in interest in the experiences of European women in India at the time of the rebellion, and how rumors of their mistreatment at the hands of Indian men fostered the racist British trope of the barbaric Indian. However, little scholarly attention has been paid to the roles and experiences of everyday Indian women during the uprising.
To conclude, the history of the rebellion can be viewed from many perspectives, so much so there is not even consensus over its name. There is a tendency in the British literature to refer to the events of 1857 as a revolt or mutiny, terms which downplay the idea that the rebellion had a coherent political ideology. Some writers refer to it as specifically Sepoy Mutiny, which emphasizes the importance of the military strand of the uprising over its civilian components. Meanwhile, the Indian nationalist literature used the term the First War of Indian Independence, situating the events of the period as an important initial step towards freedom and colonial rule. Interestingly, as historiographers try to get a more accurate view of the events of 1857, some perspectives merge while new ones are born. This is our bibliography.